The springs are left, but there's no cushions because there's 200 mice living in it. My dad growing up, he lived in the town we still live in now. He's actually, he's my boss. So he runs the company. It's a good thing, bad thing. We've kind of worked out a good relationship. In the beginning, it was a little bit rocky working for your dad, but we kind of figured it out. And I think that's kind of what makes us a good team now and kind of creates a good vibe at GlassParency is we go at it, but it kind of always, at the end of the day, has a reason for it. My dad growing up had this next door neighbor who had a 67 GTO. When he grew up, he grew up in a very modest family. Didn't always have money to do things. Didn't always have money for new cars, things like that. So to see where he built his business today it's a real success story. But growing up, he had this next door neighbor with a 67 Pontiac GTO. And as a kid, he would look over the fence all the time and say, that guy's got it going on. I want that car one day. How do I afford a car like that one day? So that was kind of his dream, was to always own that car. Fast forward 30 years, 35 years. I was probably in 9th grade at the time. I was probably 16 years old. And he kind of said, do you want to build a car? And I was like, what do you mean build a car? Like he's a car guy. He enjoys cars, but he doesn't build cars. I tinker with cars. I'm not a car builder. So I was like, what do you mean you want to build a car? He said, my next door neighbor growing up had this 67 GTO. I'm going to try to buy it from him. All right, we'll give it a shot. So he approached his neighbor. His neighbor didn't want to sell it because he's had it in his family for X amount of years. He bought it new. He drove it, and then it sat for 20 years, but he didn't want to sell it. So my dad kind of told him the story that as a kid, I would look over the fence all the time and I'd see this car and I always wanted to own this car one day. So the guy, John, actually eventually said, you know what? I'll sell it to you. It took about 4 or 5 years to fully restore. We did a full frame-off restoration. So like I said, we had really no experience doing a frame-up restoration on a car. So the first thing we did was we pulled in the garage and we vacuumed all the mouth out of it. Because, when you let a car sit for 20 years, the springs are left, but there's no cushions because there's 200 mice living in it. So we kind of ripped the whole car apart, and right away we probably got in a little over our heads because we were so anxious to just start tearing this thing apart. We didn't label where anything came from. So we ended up with this big box of just parts. We ripped out the whole interior, but we just had parts everywhere. So that's kind of when we brought it to the first shop, and they looked at us like we were nuts. Like we handed them a box of parts, and we said, we don't know what we just did. Can you help us? They kind of looked at us like we were idiots. We probably were, but it was fun. You know what I mean? I remember tearing that thing apart and vacuuming all the crap out of it. And the cool thing is, out of everything that was done to this car, the only thing that didn't actually need to be fixed was the interior. The interior was in almost perfect condition somehow, which is unheard of in the Northeast, to actually have something on a car sit for 20 years and actually last. That was cool to see that the interior is still original. You get in that thing and it smells like it's 1967, but that's the whole point of building a car like that, is you want that nostalgic feel. So we didn't want to go crazy and do like a resto mod. We wanted to actually keep it to the original factory specs. So when it was done, all the parts were paint coated to the way it was paint coated when it left the factory. So it's probably one of the best examples I've seen as far as true to a factory built car that it kind of exists around us. We have one other friend who builds, Pontiacs and things like that, GM cars. And that's kind of like why we did it that way, is because he kind of influenced it. He says, you got everything here original, you got to build it original. And it turned out amazing. But the coolest thing my dad did with this car is he promised this guy, John, that when this car's driving, I'll let you have the first ride. So when we finished building this car, it kind of bounced around a bunch of shops over the course of 4 years. He had it flatbedded from the last shop that finished it, flatbedded to this guy, John's house. So when we unloaded it off the flatbed and John got in with his wife and drove it for the first time, we drove around the block, came back about 15 minutes later. He got out of the car and said, how much do you want for it? He wanted to buy the car back because it just rotted on the side of his house for 20 years. And when he got back into it, it was what he remembered being 30 years old, driving to work every day in this car. So he wanted to buy it back, but my dad kind of joked about it. And, every once in a while we'll swing by and he'll let him take it for a ride. That was kind of like where I learned some value from my dad. You know what I mean? Like, he was a man of his word, and, he kind of had this dream that he wanted to build this car, but he wanted to make sure that the guy he bought it from, who was also a car guy, enjoyed that first, that last ride with it. So fast forward 10 years from the first day he bought it from John. The car actually is sitting in our showroom right now at our office. We kind of have a little showroom where we rotate some friends or our classic cars or whatever just in the office. And that car sits there every day, and all the time my dad walks over to the area, and he's got a couple other stuff some nice stuff, some other random car things that he bought. And he always walks past me and goes, yeah, I want to sell this thing. I want to get rid of it. And when he gets to the GTO, he's like, I can't get rid of this one. So out of all the stuff he owns and all the junk and cool cars and junk cars, that GTO will probably always be sitting there. So when you think of like the definition of success, sometimes it's not about your definition, it's about what other people define it. So what I mean by that is, like, if they see you driving around a McLaren, they think you're successful. To my dad, it was building that car, because that car was the car he looked at every day and said, one day I want to own that. 30 years ago, it was just a GTO. You know what I mean? Today it's still just a GTO. It's nothing that special. I mean, older guys, they'll say, oh, they'll walk around the car for an hour, but at the end of the day, it's not a McLaren. But that's kind of his definition of success, was to buy something that he always wanted to own and rebuild it and drive around in it. This wasn't to be seen in the Ferrari or McLaren. It was to drive that car that he couldn't afford and he wanted to afford one day. So everyone in the office obviously saw him as successful. He created this business from really a small little garage to the business it is today. And, his clients and family and friends all thought he was successful. But probably the moment that he really thought he was successful was when he kind of built that car. Built the car that he wanted to own. And that was probably the moment when now he could kind of walk around the office and see that car and knows, the building's great, but that car is really what drove me to want to build something.